Hey everyone, so what if happiness isn't the answer to morality? In my last video, I looked at utilitarianism as a moral framework that some decision makers will use to make their decision, and why it's important to understand that in the policy formulation stage of the policy cycle. Now, I also mentioned that there were other frameworks that decision makers could use, and so in this video I wanted to explore another one, which is John Rawls Justice as Fairness framework. So let's get right into it. John Rawls' theory came at a time when many philosophers and political theorists were struggling with the ethics of capitalism, inequality, and the role of justice in modern democracies. The theory itself comes out of a thought experiment, and it can't really be understood without us walking through that thought experiment ourselves. Imagine you're creating a new society, but you don't know anything about yourself, whether you'll be rich or poor, powerful or powerless, or naturally talented or inept. What kind of rules would you create for this society to ensure fairness? That is the thought experiment that John Rawls went through to come up with his Justice as Fairness framework. It all starts in the original position behind a veil of ignorance. In this world, people are rational, but unaware of almost everything. Their personal characteristics, social status, natural talents, or even the nature of their society. He calls this being behind a veil of ignorance. The reason he considers this necessary is to avoid anybody designing principles that advantage themselves. The goal at this stage is to determine a set of principles or criteria for determining what is morally right. Now, he believes that two principles would come out of such a scenario. First, that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty, compatible with a similar liberty for others. In other words, he believes that everyone's basic freedoms should be guaranteed, so long as those freedoms don't interfere with the freedoms of anyone else. Now, he believes that this would come out of the original position behind the veil of ignorance, because he believes that every rational person would universally value freedom. Regardless of one's place in society, fundamental freedoms allow one to pursue their own conception of a good life. Further, because behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know if you will be in a disadvantaged position, guaranteeing fundamental freedoms is a protection against potential injustices. Now, the basic liberties that he focuses on most are the freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of association, the right to vote, and protections against arbitrary arrest and discrimination. The second principle is called the difference principle. It states that the social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged member of society. In other words, inequalities are only permissible so long as they benefit the least advantaged member of society, and there is fair and equal opportunity to be in a better position. Now, if there is a tie for which option maximizes the position of the least advantaged member of society, you would look at the second least advantaged member of society, and so on. This is the maxi-min principle, maximizing the minimum life prospects that you could end up with. Again, he believes that in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, people would be focused on protecting themselves if they were to end up in the most disadvantaged position in society, rather than gambling that they are someone more well off. Now, this doesn't mean strict equality, because he does acknowledge that inequalities that allow for incentives for productivity are important, so long as the benefits are shared amongst the least well-off members of society. In other words, economic inequalities are only permitted so long as they grow the economic pie and the least well-off members of society get more pie than if they were strict equality. Think of it like this. Imagine a group of people on a stranded island. If some individuals are better at fishing or building tools, everyone benefits so long as the resources are shared with the least well-off individuals on the island. It's not about punishing success. Rawls' difference principle allows for inequalities so long as they help those at the bottom live better lives. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about life prospects as part of this framework, it's not strictly the same as happiness under utilitarianism. Life prospects includes things like access to education and jobs, income and wealth, and intangible things like self-respect. So it's similar to happiness, but strictly speaking, not the exact same thing. So here's something to think about. Do you think that in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, these are the two principles of justice that you would come up with? Let me know down in the comments if you can think of a different principle that you would come up with. So how would this differ from the utilitarian view that we looked at in the last video? Well, let's start with the first principle. Utilitarians would be okay with limiting some people's basic freedoms so long as doing that generated more happiness than allowing this individual to keep their basic freedom. This is a trade-off that Rawls finds completely unacceptable. So for instance, take freedom of speech. If someone is using their freedom of speech to say something that generates unhappiness for others, and that unhappiness is more than the happiness that the speaker gains from saying whatever it is they're saying, then under a utilitarian framework, it would be okay to limit their freedom of speech. But again, that is not acceptable under the justice as fairness framework. Now, thinking about the second principle, it's easiest to think about this in the context of taxation for redistribution. Under a Rawlsian framework, the pain that wealthy individuals face in paying taxes is not even considered. It's only considered in terms of how it affects their productivity. So this would mean setting all taxes so that they maximize government revenue, considering how people react to the tax. This means setting it at the top of the Laffer curve to maximize government revenue so that they can give the biggest redistribution to the least well-off members of society. Utilitarianism, by contrast, would look at the unhappiness of those paying the tax against the happiness of those receiving the redistribution payments. As long as the happiness generated is greater than the unhappiness, it would be acceptable. But once the unhappiness of those paying the tax is more than the happiness of those receiving the redistribution payments, the tax would not go any higher. As I mentioned last week, though, there can be a real challenge to understand the impact of money on happiness when you're comparing between wealthy and poor individuals who likely have a very different value associated with getting or paying more money. Now, I do also want to say that it's entirely possible that these two tax levels end up being the same. It could be that the happiness generated from redistribution continues up to the maximum government revenue point. And so both taxes could be set the same, but that's not necessarily true under these two different frameworks. Now, bringing this back to the world of public policy, if you're designing policies for a decision maker who follows a Rawlsian ethical framework, you would have to think about two things. One, ensuring that the policies do not interfere with the fundamental freedoms of anyone. And secondly, that it follows the difference principle. That is, that it maximizes the life prospects of the least well-off member of society. Let's think through this with a couple of examples. First, healthcare. Under a Rawlsian ethical framework, you would want to ensure that the least well-off member of society has access to good healthcare, even if it significantly increases taxes and causes wait times to grow for everyone else. Again, this isn't necessarily true under a utilitarian framework where the pain of those higher taxes and longer wait times would be factored in. Another example would be debates around climate change. A Rawlsian might argue for more stringent environmental protections if the effects of climate change are having greater impact on the least well-off member of society than the impact of addressing climate change, again, would have on the least well-off member of society, as that's the person that matters most for the difference principle. While frameworks like Rawls's Justice as Fairness or utilitarianism are powerful tools, real-world decision makers rarely rely on just one framework for making decisions. Instead, they often use a mix of theories. For instance, think of someone who values protecting fundamental freedoms, but follows a utilitarian framework when they're thinking about social and economic distributions of opportunities. This is, again, something that you would have to think about when you're designing policies for that decision maker. Now, the blending of different theories is very common because it can be challenging to fully capture the diverse needs and values of a society. Now, some of the major critiques of the Justice as Fairness framework surround the fact that it promotes significant economic inefficiency, which can lead to significantly slower growth over time. And so how would the Justice as Fairness framework position the least advantaged person today against the least advantaged person tomorrow? It's not clear. The other thing is, how do you assess the life prospects of the least advantaged member of society? Or how do you even determine who the least well-off member of society is? Much like utilitarianism, it can be really hard to calculate someone's happiness or life prospects under this framework. But despite these critiques, the Justice as Fairness framework remains one of the most significant and influential theories in modern political discourse. It has shaped debates on social justice, welfare policies, and human rights across the globe. Let me know in the comments if there's other ethical frameworks you would like me to take a look at on this channel, and I'll be sure to explore those in a future video. But for now, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.